November 3, 1942. Oberfeldwebel Klaus Hartmann stood beside his 88mm Flak 37 at the Ruhr Valley Industrial Complex, watching the autumn sky through binoculars as his 11-man crew completed their morning drill. 15 seconds. That's how long it had taken them to bring the gun into action from travelling position. Not bad, but Hartmann wanted 12. The mathematics of aerial defence were simple and brutal. A bomber formation at 25,000 feet gave you perhaps 90 seconds from first radar contact to bombs away. In those 90 seconds, your battery of 4 guns had to calculate altitude, bearing, speed, set fuses, and fire enough 17-pound shells to fill a specific piece of sky with 1,500 metal fragments per burst. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Hartmann's battery had claimed 3 confirmed kills in the past month, British bombers, mostly, lumbering Halifaxes and Stirlings that came at night, alone or in loose streams. Easy targets once the searchlights caught them. But intelligence briefings were now warning of something different. The Americans were coming, and unlike the British, who had learned the hard lessons of daylight bombing the costly way, the Americans believed they could fly straight into Germany in broad daylight and bomb with precision. They believed their bombers' defensive guns would protect them. Hartmann had laughed at the briefing. Every flak crew in Germany had laughed. The American B-17 Flying Fortress carried 950 caliber machine guns, impressive, perhaps, to a ground soldier, meaningless to a flak battery that engaged targets from 3,000 meters away, far beyond the effective range of any aircraft machine gun. The Americans would learn what the British had learned in 1940, daylight bombing over Germany, and was suicide. By Christmas, Hartmann expected, the Americans would abandon their foolish doctrine and join the British in night raids. What Hartmann didn't know that November morning was that American tactical planners were developing something Germany's air defense doctrine had never anticipated. Not a new type of aircraft, not a revolutionary bomb, something far more dangerous, a formation so densely packed and precisely coordinated that it would transform individual bombers into a single organism bristling with hundreds of machine guns. Within 8 months, Hartmann would witness this formation firsthand, and the experience would haunt him for the rest of his life. The German 88mm flak gun was not merely good, it was arguably the finest anti-aircraft weapon of World War II. The lineage traced back to 1925, when German military planners, restricted by the Versailles Treaty from developing artillery on German soil, worked secretly through the Swedish Bofors Company. The goal was creating a weapon capable of destroying bombers at their maximum operating altitude, which in the mid-1920s meant approximately 20,000 feet. The initial 75mm designs were rejected. German Army ordnance insisted on greater destructive power. At the distances involved in anti-aircraft work, direct hits were nearly impossible. The strategy was predictive fire. Use mathematical calculations to estimate where bombers would be when shells reached their altitude, then fill that piece of sky with explosions. Each shell needed to carry enough explosive to guarantee kills within a 200-yard radius. The 75mm lacked sufficient punch. In 1931, designers settled on 88mm, 3.46 inches in diameter. The Flak 18 prototype appeared in 1928. After Hitler took power in 1933, Germany abandoned all pretense of Versailles compliance and began mass production. By the time World War II began in September 1939, over 2,500 Flak 1836 and 37 guns were in service. The technical specifications were remarkable. Maximum vertical range exceeded 32,000 feet, well above the operational ceiling of any bomber then flying. Effective ceiling was 26,000 feet, meaning shells could reach and reliably detonate at bomber altitudes. Rate of fire was 15 to 20 rounds per minute with a trained crew. The gun could rotate 360 degrees on its cruciform mount and elevate to 85 degrees. The standard high-explosive shell weighed 8.8 kilograms, slightly over 19 pounds. Actually, 17 pounds is more precise. These shells were fitted with either barometric fuses, calibrated to specific altitudes, or time delay fuses. When they detonated, each shell fragmented into 1,500 or more jagged steel shards, traveling at lethal velocity in all directions. Any aircraft within 200 yards of a burst was at extreme risk. The fragments could penetrate aluminum skin like paper, sever control cables, puncture fuel tanks, kill crew members, destroy engines. But raw destructive power meant nothing without accurate fire control. This is where the German system demonstrated true sophistication. Heavy flak batteries deployed in formations of 4 guns arranged in a square, typically separated by approximately 100 meters. In the center sat the Kommandogerät 40, the fire control computer. This analog mechanical computer was a marvel of pre-digital engineering. It required 5 men to operate. The system incorporated a 4-meter optical rangefinder, a mechanical computer that processed target data, and cable connections to all 4 guns simultaneously. The process worked like this. Radar or visual observation detected incoming bombers. The rangefinder crew measured distance and tracked movement. The computer calculated current position, direction, speed, and altitude. Most critically, it calculated where the target would be when shells reached altitude. Time of flight for an 88mm shell to 25,000 feet was approximately 30 seconds. A bomber formation flying at 180 miles per hour covered 1.5 miles in 30 seconds. The computer had to aim at where the bombers would be, not where they were. Once calculations were complete, the Kommandogerät transmitted elevation and azimuth settings directly to all 4 guns via electrical cables. The guns' automatic systems received these settings and adjusted accordingly. Each gun crew's job was simply to load and fire as rapidly as possible. The system could place 4 shells into a predetermined piece of sky every 3 seconds. When multiple batteries coordinated fire, they could create what bomber crews would call iron cumulus, a literal cloud of exploding steel. A single heavy flak battery consisted of 4 to 6 heavy guns, usually 88mm, plus 2 light 20mm guns for close-in defense of the battery itself. Battery commanders were typically Luftwaffe officers, the flak arm being a Luftwaffe responsibility. Gun crews were 11 men per weapon, gun commander, gun layer who controlled elevation, aimer who controlled traverse, loader, fuse setter, 5 ammunition handlers, and the vehicle driver who towed the gun. The 11 men worked with choreographed precision born of relentless drill. A veteran crew could bring the gun from traveling position to ready in under 2 minutes. Detach wheels. Lower the cruciform mount's 4 outriggers, stake them to the ground with the leveling jacks. Connect power. Connect the fire control cables. Load the first shell. Ready to fire. 2 minutes from a gun being towed down a road to putting a shell at 25,000 feet. By late 1942, Germany's air defense network had grown into a massive undertaking. 900,000 personnel operated 10,000 anti-aircraft guns defending the Reich. This number would eventually exceed 1 million. The guns were concentrated around key targets: Berlin, Hamburg, the Ruhr Industrial Valley, synthetic oil plants, aircraft factories, anywhere the Allies might strike. The psychological impact of flak on bomber crews cannot be overstated. Fighter attacks, terrifying as they were, could be fought. Gunners could shoot back, pilots could take evasive action, but flak offered no defense except luck. You flew straight through it during the bomb run. No evasive maneuvers were permitted because the Norden bomb site required stable level flight to calculate release point. You sat at your station, watched the black bursts appear around your aircraft, felt the concussive force rock the plane, heard the shrapnel slam into aluminum, and prayed. American bomber crews called it iron cumulus or flak carpet. From a distance, the bursts looked like black polka dots against blue sky. Up close, they revealed orange and red centers as shells detonated. If you were close enough to see the color, you were in the kill zone. Each burst created a sound like a massive sheet of metal being torn in half. The psychological strain was immense. As historian Stephen Ambrose noted, flak converted more men to Christianity than Peter and Paul combined. By January 1943, German flak crews had developed tremendous confidence. They had shot down hundreds of British bombers. They understood their weapon systems intimately. They trusted their fire control computers. They knew that bombers had to fly straight and level during bomb runs, making them predictable targets. The mathematics favored the defense. A bomber formation approaching a heavily defended target would spend 2 to 3 minutes in range of heavy flak. 3 minutes meant firing 40 to 60 shells per gun. 16 guns in a 4-battery grouping meant approximately 900 shells. 900 shells meant 900 bursts. 900 bursts meant over 1 million steel fragments filling the airspace. No bomber formation could survive that kind of fire without losses. German doctrine called it the certainty ring. Calculate the volume of airspace a formation would occupy during its bomb run. Fill that volume with a statistically certain quantity of bursting shells. Some bombers would survive through luck, others would be damaged. A percentage would be destroyed. The percentages were measurable, predictable, and in Germany's favour, or so it seemed in late 1942. What German flak doctrine failed to anticipate was the psychological dimension of combat that only emerged when formations reached truly massive scale. The doctrine assumed bombers were targets, passive recipients of ground fire. This assumption was entirely reasonable given all previous experience. Aircraft machine guns had effective ranges of perhaps half a mile, flak batteries engaged from 2 miles or more. There was no tactical interaction between bomber gunners and flak crews beyond the bombers attempting to dodge predicted fire. But doctrine, even excellent doctrine, contains hidden assumptions, and the Americans were about to violate one of those assumptions so thoroughly that German flak crews would experience something unprecedented in the history of anti-aircraft warfare. The moment when prey stopped being prey, the moment when targets became threats, the moment when looking up at bomber formations no longer felt like hunting, but like being hunted. The combat box formation emerged from desperate necessity during the winter of 1942 to 1943. Colonel Curtis LeMay, commanding the 305th Bombardment Group at RAF Chelveston in England, faced a brutal tactical problem. German fighters had discovered the B-17's critical weakness, the nose. Forward. Armament consisted of only 2 manually aimed 50 caliber guns with limited fields of fire. German fighters developed head-on attacks, flying straight at bomber formations at full throttle, raking the nose and cockpit with 20mm cannon fire, killing pilots, destroying flight controls, sending bombers down in flames. The existing formations were inadequate. 6-plane squadrons, separated by 2 to 4 miles, couldn't provide mutual defensive fire support. At that separation, an aircraft under attack was essentially alone. Its guns had a 3,500-foot effective range, just over half a mile. Aircraft 2 to 4 miles away might as well have been on different continents. LeMay needed something that concentrated defensive fire while avoiding mid-air collisions and maintaining bombing effectiveness. The breakthrough came in December 1942 with the Javelin Down formation. 18 bombers arranged in 6 3-plane elements, organized into 3 squadrons, stacked both vertically and horizontally. Lead squadron in the middle, high squadron above and to one side, low squadron below and to the other side. The genius was stacking planes downward toward the Sunday. This aided gunners on higher aircraft in seeing lower aircraft without glare, while creating overlapping fields of fire covering every approach angle. The formation was 600 feet high from lowest to highest bomber, 500 feet deep front to back, nearly 2,500 feet wide. Most critically, every bomber could bring multiple guns to bear on an attacking fighter from almost any direction. On December 6, 1942, the 305th Bomb Group flew the Javelin Down for the first time in combat during a mission to Lille, France. German fighters made several passes. None penetrated the concentrated defensive fire. The formation worked so well that the other B-17 groups in England immediately adopted it. By January 1943, LeMay refined the formation into a 21-plane wedge, adding a third 3-plane element to the most exposed squadron. This became standard through September of that year, but the true innovation came when the 8th Air Force scaled up. By spring 1943, The American bomber force had grown to 16 groups of B-17s and 4 groups of B-24 Liberators. Mission sizes reached 100 to 200 bombers. The combat wing formation was born. 3 groups flying together, stacked vertically and horizontally, created a 54-plane formation. This wing box occupied approximately 3,000 feet of vertical space, 7,000 feet deep, 2,000 feet across. The numbers were staggering. 54 B-17G model bombers, each carrying 1350 caliber Browning M2 machine guns, 702 heavy machine guns total in a single wing formation. Each gun capable of firing 750 rounds per minute. Effective range 3,500 feet. The tactical implications were profound. A German fighter attacking such a formation faced a simple mathematical reality. Dozens of gunners would simultaneously track him visually. His aircraft would be visible to gunners in perhaps 15 to 20 bombers, depending on approach angle. That meant 30 to 40 50 caliber machine guns could engage him. At 750 rounds per minute, that's 22,500 to 30,000 rounds per minute total, or 375 to 500 rounds per second. A closing speed of 500 miles per hour in a head-on attack meant a fighter pilot had approximately 3 seconds from opening fire to mandatory breakaway. In those 3 seconds, over 1,000 rounds would converge on his flight path. The psychological impact on Luftwaffe pilots was immediate and severe. They began calling B-17 combat box formations Fliegendes Stachelschwein, flying porcupine. The term perfectly captured what attacking such formations felt like. A porcupine doesn't fight back aggressively, but approaching one means getting stuck with dozens of quills from every direction. Oberfeldwebel Heinz Nock, a Luftwaffe ace with 33 confirmed victories, described attacking American formations in his combat diary. Attacking the American bombers is like flying into a wall of fire. The tracers come from every direction. You pick your target, line up for the attack, and suddenly the air around you fills with red tracers. Tracers were visible because American ammunition belts loaded every 5th round as a tracer, allowing gunners to observe fire and correct aim. At night, tracer streams looked like orange fingers reaching out from formations. During daylight, the tracers created the impression of dozens of fiery needles extending in all directions. The visual effect was intimidating even before considering the 4 non-tracer rounds between each visible tracer. Major Anton Haeckel, who ended the war with 192 confirmed victories, explained the tactical dilemma. If one came in from the rear, there was a long period closing from 1,000 meters to our firing range of 400 meters when the bombers were firing at us, but we could not effectively return fire. The 50 caliber guns on the bombers had longer range than our guns. But here's what neither Koch nor Haeckel nor any Luftwaffe pilot mentioned, because from their perspective at altitude, engaging bombers in air-to-air combat, it never occurred to them. The combat box's 700 machine guns didn't just fire at attacking fighters. When formations passed over German territory, all those guns pointed in every direction, including straight down. And German flak crews, manning their stations on the ground, were directly beneath them. Klaus Hartmann first encountered an American combat wing formation on April 17, 1943. The target was Focke-Wulf aircraft factory at Bremen, 200 miles northwest of his position in the Ruhr Valley. His battery wasn't involved in that defense, but that evening, officers from batteries that had engaged the Americans gathered at headquarters for debriefing. Hartmann attended because his battery commander was ill. The reports were encouraging. The Americans had dispatched 115 B-17s to Bremen. German fighters and Flak had shot down 16, a loss rate of nearly 14%, unsustainable for the Americans if maintained. But something else emerged in the debriefing that Hartmann found curious. Several battery commanders mentioned experiencing return fire, not from fighters, from the bombers themselves, 50 caliber machine gun rounds impacting near gun positions. Not accurate fire, exactly, but fire nonetheless. One Flak commander reported 3 of his crew wounded when bullets struck near their position. The briefing officer dismissed these reports. Bombers flying at 25,000 feet, nearly 5 miles high, couldn't possibly engage ground targets effectively with machine guns. The fire was probably random defensive shooting or nervous American gunners wasting ammunition. It would stop once the Americans gained combat experience. Hartmann wasn't convinced. 50 caliber machine gun rounds had enormous range. Maximum range exceeded 4 miles. That was horizontal range, but in a descending trajectory from altitude, the effective range could be even greater. And 700 machine guns created an enormous volume of fire. Even wild, inaccurate shooting might prove dangerous if the sheer quantity was high enough. He kept these thoughts to himself. The briefing ended. Officers returned to their units. Life continued. Spring turned to summer. American raids increased in size and frequency. The combat box formations appeared more often. And slowly, gradually, German flak crews began noticing something that contradicted every assumption built into their doctrine and training. They were being shot at, not by fighters, by the bombers. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. July 29, 1943. The mission was Kiel, Germany's northern naval port. Klaus Hartmann's battery had been repositioned 3 weeks earlier to defend the submarine construction yards. The radar station reported inbound formations at 0930 hours, altitude 26,000 feet. Estimated strength, 180 aircraft. The numbers kept growing. Week after week, month after month, the Americans came in greater numbers. Hartmann's battery commander, Hauptmann Werner Dietrich, positioned the crews at their guns. The Kommandoggerett operators began calculations: range, bearing, altitude, predicted path, fuse settings. The formation appeared first as a dark smudge on the northern horizon, growing larger. Then individual aircraft became visible. Not a loose stream like British night bombers, a solid geometric structure, boxes within boxes, layers stacked vertically. The Americans flew in what looked like precision parade formation, even though they knew German fighters and flak would tear into them. The fire control director called out coordinates. Guns elevated to 70 degrees. The first salvo fired at 9:37. 4 shells climbed toward the formation. 30 seconds later, black bursts appeared among the bombers. Too low. The second salvo adjusted. Direct altitude. The shells burst in the heart of the formation. Hartmann, watching through binoculars, saw one bomber trailing smoke. A second staggered but held position. Good shooting. Then something hit the ground 15 meters from Hartmann's position. A sharp crack. Dirt and grass erupted upward. He dove behind the gun shield instinctively. Another impact. Another. A sound like hail on a tin roof, but louder, harder. Metal striking metal. Hartmann looked up. Bullets were hitting around the gun position. Not shrapnel from their own shells. Bullets. 50 caliber bullets. From the bombers. From 26,000 feet up. The battery's light, 20mm guns returned fire, but those weapons maxed out at 12,000 feet. Useless. The heavy 88s couldn't depress low enough to engage high-altitude targets directly overhead. Hartmann's battery was designed to shoot at aircraft 3 to 5 miles away horizontally. They had no defense against aircraft directly above them, except the gun shield and prayer. The formation passed overhead. The bomb run lasted approximately 4 minutes. 4 minutes during which Hartmann's battery fired 32 shells, scoring several hits. But during those same 4 minutes, somewhere between 2,000 and 3,050 caliber rounds fell on and around his battery position. Most missed. The Americans weren't aiming. They couldn't aim effectively from that altitude. But they didn't need to aim. 700 machine guns firing in roughly the same direction created a beaten zone, hundreds of meters wide. Probability, not precision, made the fire dangerous. When the formation disappeared south, Hartmann inspected his gun position. Bullet impacts pockmarked the ground. The gun shield showed 3 fresh dents where rounds had struck and deflected. One of his ammunition handlers, Gefreiter Müller, had been hit in the left arm. Not seriously, but he was bleeding and would require medical attention. The loader's helmet showed a crease where a bullet had grazed it without penetrating, 6 centimeters lower, and he would be dead. Hartmann filed his report. Hauptmann Dietrich forwarded it through channels. Similar reports came from other batteries that day. And the next mission. And the mission after that. By August 1943, a pattern was undeniable. American combat wing formations didn't just defend against fighters. They saturated everything beneath them with machine gun fire. Not targeted fire. Volume fire. The mathematical principle was brutally simple. 700 guns firing for 3 to 4 minutes during a bomb run generated approximately 160,000 rounds. Most fell harmlessly, but 1% hitting near battery positions meant 1,600 bullets, enough to wound crews, damage equipment, and create constant psychological pressure. The psychological impact was worse than the physical danger. German flak doctrine assumed crews were hunters. They detected bombers, calculated firing solutions, engaged targets at range. The crews controlled the engagement. They chose when to fire. The bombers could only fly through the barrage and hope for survival. The power dynamic was clear. Ground forces engaged aerial targets from positions of relative safety, but the American combat boxes violated this assumption. When formations passed overhead, flak crews experienced something infantry soldiers facing air attack knew intimately: the helplessness of being targeted from above with no effective means of fighting back. The 88mm gun was devastating against aircraft at altitude and range, but against aircraft directly overhead, it was nearly useless. Elevation limits prevented pointing the gun straight up. Even if they could, engaging targets overhead meant shells falling back on friendly positions. The Americans weren't trying to destroy flak batteries with machine gun fire. They knew the odds of killing a well-protected gun position from 25,000 feet were minimal. The goal was psychological: make German crews afraid, disrupt their concentration, force them to seek cover during bomb runs. Anything that reduced the accuracy and volume of flak fire improved bomber survival. And it worked. Flak crews began wearing helmets constantly during engagements. Previously, many commanders had been casual about helmets, viewing them as unnecessary since the primary threat was aircraft at altitude, not ground combat. Now helmets were mandatory. Crews dug deeper slit trenches near gun positions. They added overhead cover where possible. Some batteries positioned their light 20mm guns to fire upward, not for effect, but for morale. Giving crews something to shoot back with, even ineffectively, reduced the psychological strain. The breaking point came during the mission to Schweinfurt on October 14, 1943. This mission would be remembered as Black Thursday, the bloodiest day in 8th Air Force history. 291 B-17s attacked the ball-bearing plants deep in southern Germany. No fighter escort could reach the target. The bombers went alone. The Luftwaffe scrambled every available fighter. Over 300 German aircraft attacked the bomber stream in coordinated waves. Klaus Hartmann's battery had been moved again, this time to defend a synthetic oil plant near Gelsenkirchen in the Ruhr Valley. His position was approximately 300 kilometers northwest of Schweinfurt. His battery wouldn't engage those bombers, but they engaged another formation that same day, hitting targets in the Ruhr. The intensity was unlike anything Hartmann had experienced. The formation consisted of 72 B-17s arranged in 4 combat wings, nearly 1,000 machine guns overhead. The Americans knew this mission would be costly. They flew tighter formations than usual. The bombing altitude was lower than normal, only 23,000 feet, to improve accuracy. Lower altitude meant the machine gun fire was more concentrated, more accurate, more deadly. Hartmann's battery engaged at 9:52. The formation approached from the northwest. Fire control calculated a perfect intercept. The first salvo exploded among the lead wing. One bomber took a direct hit and exploded mid-air. A second fell out of formation trailing fire. Excellent shooting. The crew reloaded frantically. Second salvo. Third. Fourth. The bombers didn't break formation. They held position, flying straight and level despite the flak. Then the return fire started. Not sporadic rounds like previous missions, a sustained barrage. The sound was overwhelming, bullets striking earth, bullets striking metal, the sharp cracks as rounds passed overhead. Hartmann crouched behind the gun shield. One of his ammunition handlers screamed. The man had been running forward with a shell. A bullet hit him in the chest. He went down. The shell rolled across the ground. Another handler grabbed it, loaded the gun, kept firing. The formation passed. The bomb run lasted 5 minutes. 5 minutes that felt like 5 hours. When silence finally returned, Hartmann surveyed the damage. 3 men wounded, 1 seriously. The wounded ammunition handler would die before reaching the hospital. Multiple bullet impacts on the gun itself, though none disabled it. The Kommandogeret had taken 2 hits but remained functional. Shrapnel from their own shells, falling back to earth, had damaged one of the battery's trucks. But the worst damage was invisible. Hartmann saw it in his crew's faces. The shock, the realization that they were no longer safe in their positions. That manning a flak gun beneath American formations meant exposing yourself to fire you couldn't effectively return. The power dynamic had shifted. Prey had become predator. Targets had become threats. Reports from Schweinfurt were worse. The Americans lost 60 B-17s shot down by fighters and flak. Another 17 returned so damaged they were scrapped. But the German defenders paid a price too. Flak batteries reported unprecedented casualties and equipment damage from return fire. Multiple gun positions hit, crews forced to abandon their posts temporarily during the heaviest bomber overhead passes. Fire control disrupted, accuracy degraded. German Flak command analyzed the situation. The conclusion was uncomfortable. American combat wing formations, when operating at maximum strength, created defensive firepower that affected not just attacking fighters but ground forces as well. The effect wasn't decisive. Flak batteries continued, engaging effectively, but the psychological burden was real and measurable. November 1943 brought the first tactical adjustments. Flak batteries defending major targets received orders to construct reinforced shelters for crews, not full bunkers, which were impractical for mobile batteries, but covered positions that offered protection from fire from above, while allowing rapid movement to guns when needed. Some batteries experimented with positioning light automatic weapons to fire suppressive fire upward during bomber passes. This accomplished little beyond morale. The real change was operational tempo. Battery commanders received new guidance. Don't expose crews unnecessarily during the initial approach. Wait until formations were in optimal range. Fire concentrated salvos. Then seek cover during the period when formations passed directly overhead and return fire was heaviest. Resume firing as formations departed. This reduced exposure but also reduced total shells fired per mission. Effectiveness dropped measurably. American tactical planners noticed. Intelligence reports from the European theatre indicated German flak fire became less intense after November 1943. Some batteries appeared to cease firing temporarily during critical portions of bomb runs. The cause was initially unclear. Eventually, interrogation of captured flak personnel revealed the truth. The combat box formation's concentrated machine gun fire was suppressing anti-aircraft defenses through sheer volume. This effect amplified dramatically when American fighter escorts reached sufficient range to accompany bombers to target. P-47 Thunderbolts with drop tanks could reach 275 miles from base by September 1943. P-51 Mustangs, arriving in February 1944, could escort to Berlin and back. With fighters suppressing German interceptors, bomber formations flew tighter boxes and maintained formation. Discipline better. More machine guns concentrated in smaller volumes of airspace. More return fire falling on German positions. By spring 1944, the situation had reversed completely from late 1942. German flak batteries, once confident hunters, now operated under constant psychological pressure. The 88mm gun remained technically excellent. Fire control systems still calculated solutions accurately. Crews still trained relentlessly. But the fundamental assumption that flak crews engaged from positions of relative safety had been shattered. Klaus Hartmann survived the war. In 1947, interviewed by British occupation authorities gathering data on German air defence operations, he described the evolution of his experience. In 1942, we feared missing our targets. We feared equipment failure. We feared being bombed directly. We did not fear the bombers' guns. By 1944, we feared the bombers' guns as much as we feared the bombs. More, perhaps, because you could hide from bombs in shelters. You could not hide from the machine gun fire if you stayed at your post. The statistical impact was measurable. German flak effectiveness, measured in bombers destroyed per 1,000 shells fired, peaked in mid-1943 at approximately 3.2 bombers destroyed per 1,000 shells. By mid-1944, effectiveness had dropped to approximately 1.8 bombers per 1,000 shells. Multiple factors contributed to this decline. Improved American tactics, better armor on bombers, fighter escorts. But interrogations of flak personnel consistently mentioned one factor above all others: the psychological burden of operating under return fire from massed bomber formations. The human cost was severe on both sides. The 8th Air Force lost over 4,700 B-17s in combat. German flak accounted for approximately 43% of American aircraft losses in Europe. More than fighters, flak killed and wounded tens of thousands of American airmen. But German flak crews also suffered. Exact casualty figures for flak personnel are difficult to determine, but estimates suggest over 100,000 killed or wounded through the entire war. Some from Allied bombing, some from ground combat as battles moved into Germany, but a significant percentage from what German records euphemistically called combat action during anti-aircraft operations. Return fire from bombers. The American .50 caliber Browning M2 machine gun firing from altitude didn't need to be accurate to be effective. A 72-plane formation, carrying over 900 guns, firing for 4 minutes generated approximately 200,000 rounds. If those rounds fell across a 1 square kilometer area, the density was 200 rounds per 1,000 square meters, or 1 round per 5 square meters. Not enough to guarantee hits on specific targets, more than enough to force personnel into cover and disrupt operations. The irony is that the combat box formation's primary purpose was defending against fighters. The ground suppression effect was entirely secondary, almost accidental. American tactical planners designed the formations to mass defensive firepower against Luftwaffe interceptors, but the same principles that made massed machine gun fire effective against fighters made it psychologically effective against ground personnel. The principle was ancient. Volume of fire creates zones of denial. Accuracy matters less than saturation when the goal is area suppression rather than point destruction. By the time long-range P-51 Mustang escorts became available in early 1944, the Luftwaffe fighter threat had diminished significantly. German pilot training had collapsed, fuel shortages grounded aircraft. Experienced aces were being killed faster than replacements could be trained. The Strategic Air campaign that seemed on the verge of failure in October 1943 was succeeding by spring 1944. Complete Allied air supremacy over Europe was achieved by D-Day, June 6, 1944. But the combat box formations continued, not because fighter threat remained high, because the formations improved bombing accuracy by ensuring concentrated bomb patterns, and because the massed defensive fire continued suppressing German ground defenses psychologically. The formations evolved. The 54-plane wing box, difficult to maintain and vulnerable to dispersal, gave way to looser 36-plane group formations by May 1944. But the principle remained. Bombers flew in mutually supporting formations with interlocking fields of fire. The psychological transformation was complete. In 1942, German flak crews manning their 88s viewed themselves as predators, hunters tracking bombers through mathematical calculations and precision fire. By 1944, that confidence had eroded. Crews still fought, still engaged, still killed bombers. But the fundamental psychological relationship had changed. They were no longer simply hunters. They were also targets. The bombers they shot at shot back. Klaus Hartmann's battery was overrun by British ground forces in March 1945, northwest of the Rhine. His crews destroyed their guns to prevent capture and surrendered. Of the 11 men who had served with him in November 1942 when his battery was first formed, 4 were dead. 3 from direct hits during bombing raids. 1 from machine gun fire during an engagement in July 1944 when a damaged B-17, falling out of formation, passed directly over their position at low altitude with all guns firing. 6 others had been wounded at various points and transferred. Hartmann himself had been wounded twice, once by shrapnel from an American bomb, once by a .50 caliber bullet that struck his helmet and deflected, giving him a concussion but not penetrating. In the 1960s, Hartmann was interviewed again, this time by American military historians compiling oral histories of the air war. He was asked to describe the most psychologically difficult aspect of serving in a flak battery. His answer was unexpected. The fighters we could understand. They were pilots like our pilots, fighting in aircraft, taking risks, dying when shot down. The bombers we could understand. They were crews flying missions, following orders, trying to destroy targets. What we found difficult to accept was that we, on the ground, performing a ground defense role, were being attacked by those same bombers from the air. We expected to shoot at them. We did not expect them to shoot at us. When they did, effectively, the distinction between aerial combat and ground combat dissolved. We were no longer flak crews. We were infantry under air attack, except our weapons were designed for range, not for defense. The American combat box formation remains one of the most successful tactical innovations of World War II. Military historians focus, correctly, on its effectiveness against Luftwaffe fighters. The formations forced German interceptors into head-on attacks where closing speed limited engagement time. The concentrated defensive fire shot down German fighters, forced others to break off attacks early, disrupted German gunnery, protected individual bombers through mutual support. These effects are well documented and widely understood. But the secondary effect, the psychological impact on German ground forces and particularly flak crews, receives less attention, yet this effect was real and measurable. It contributed to declining German flak effectiveness through 1944. It increased German personnel casualties. Most importantly, it violated a fundamental assumption of air defense doctrine, that ground-based anti-aircraft forces engaged aerial targets from positions of relative safety, beyond the effective range of aircraft weapons. The American combat box, with its 700 to 1,000 machine guns concentrated in formations spanning only a few thousand feet, created effective defensive firepower at ranges and volumes that made safe engagement from the ground impossible. German batteries had to expose their crews to return fire to engage effectively. The choice was accept casualties and reduced effectiveness, or cease firing and allow bombers free passage. Neither option was acceptable. German crews chose the former. They continued engaging despite casualties, but the psychological toll was severe. The final irony is that the Americans never explicitly intended this effect. The combat box was designed to defeat fighters. The ground suppression happened because the same principles that made massed fire effective against fast-moving fighters made it effective against stationary ground targets. Volume creates effect. Saturation creates suppression. The Americans built formations to concentrate firepower defensively. They discovered, almost by accident, that concentrated firepower affects everything in its path, not just the primary targets. December 6, 1942, when Curtis LeMay's 305th Bombardment Group first flew the Javelin Down formation over Lille, the tactical problem he was solving was fighter defense. The Germans attacked his bombers. His solution massed defensive guns to shoot back effectively. Simple, logical, tactically sound. What emerged over the following 2 years was something neither LeMay nor any American planner anticipated. A formation so densely packed with firepower that it transformed the battlefield beneath it. That forced German defenders to experience what it meant to be on the receiving end of overwhelming aerial firepower. That reversed the psychological dynamic of aerial versus ground combat. Klaus Hartmann died in 1983 at age 67. His war service earned him no glory. Flak crews were ground forces, not glamorous like fighter pilots or tank aces. His battery claimed 37 confirmed bomber kills through the entire war, modest compared to fighter pilots with scores of victories. But 37 bombers meant 370 lives, 37 crews lost. The mathematics of industrial warfare are impersonal and brutal. In his later years, Hartmann rarely discussed his service. When he did, he focused not on the kills or the technical aspects of operating an 88mm gun. He talked about the transition he witnessed, the evolution from confident defender in 1942 to exhausted survivor in 1945, the gradual realization that the Americans had found a way to fight back, not just with bombs but with the concentrated fire of their defensive weapons, the discovery that being a predator didn't make you immune to becoming prey. The American combat box formation represents more than tactical innovation. It represents a fundamental shift in how warfare was conducted at scale. When 54 B-17s carrying 700 machine guns flew in formation, they weren't just 54 individual aircraft, they were a single weapons system, a flying fortress in the truest sense. Not a fortress in the defensive sense of static fortification, but fortress in the sense of concentrated firepower that dominated the battlefield around it in every direction. The Germans developed excellent anti-aircraft defenses. The 88mm gun was arguably the finest weapon of its type. German fire control was sophisticated and accurate. German crews were well trained and motivated. But no amount of technical excellence could overcome the basic mathematical reality. When hundreds of heavy machine guns concentrated their fire, even from extreme altitude, the volume created effects that technical precision couldn't counter. The lesson transcends World War II. Massed firepower, even individually inaccurate, creates area effects through volume. This principle drives modern military doctrine in countless ways. Suppression through saturation remains viable, regardless of individual weapon precision. The combat box demonstrated this principle at industrial scale. 700 guns firing for 4 minutes created effects no smaller force could achieve regardless of accuracy. German flak crews in 1942 believed they controlled the aerial battlefield from the ground. They had the weapons, the training, the doctrine, the technical systems, everything necessary for effective air defense. What they lacked was appreciation for what happened when opponents concentrated firepower at unprecedented scale. The Americans didn't defeat German flak through better guns or better fire control. They defeated it through mass, through formations so densely packed that individual aircraft lost significance and the formation itself became the weapon. When Klaus Hartmann stood beside his 88mm gun in November 1942, watching the autumn sky, confident in his training and equipment, he couldn't have imagined what was coming. The Americans would bring industrial warfare to the skies over Germany at a scale that transformed everything, not through technological superiority, though American bombers were excellent, through organizational capability, through the ability to put hundreds of bombers into precise formations and send them into Germany day after day, month after month, year after year, until German defenses collapsed from sheer attrition. The combat box formation was the manifestation of American power. Not power in the sense of better individual weapons, power in the sense of industrial capacity to build 12,000 heavy bombers, organizational ability to coordinate mass operations, and tactical willingness to accept horrific casualties in pursuit of strategic objectives. German defenders faced this power daily from 1943 until war's end. They shot down thousands of bombers, killed tens of thousands of American airmen, but couldn't stop the formations from coming. And beneath those formations, German soldiers discovered what their enemies in Poland, France, and Russia had discovered when German aircraft attacked. That being targeted from the air by overwhelming firepower leaves no good options, only choices between bad and worse. Stay at your post and risk death from above. Abandon your post and fail your mission. German flak crews chose to stay. They kept firing until captured or killed. But the psychological burden of fighting beneath formations bristling with hundreds of machine guns left scars that technical excellence couldn't heal. The story of German flak crews facing American combat box formations is ultimately a story about how warfare changes when scale reaches industrial levels. Individual courage and skill still matter, but massed firepower creates effects that transcend individual capabilities. The Americans built formations that concentrated 700 machine guns in airspace measured in thousands of feet. Those formations didn't just defeat German fighters, they suppressed German ground forces. They reversed the psychological dynamic of aerial versus ground combat. They demonstrated that overwhelming force applied systematically defeats tactical excellence. Klaus Hartmann's war began with confidence. His battery had excellent weapons, good training, clear doctrine. Everything suggested German air defenses would make daylight bombing impossibly costly. The war ended with his battery destroyed, his crew's casualties, and his confidence shattered. Not because German defenders fought poorly, because they fought against an opponent who brought resources to the battle that doctrine hadn't anticipated, who concentrated firepower at scales that negated technical advantages, who kept coming despite losses that would have broken smaller forces. The American combat box formation remains a testament to what organized industrial power achieves when applied to warfare. To the young men who flew those formations through walls of flak and waves of fighters, to the crews who held position despite losses, maintained discipline despite terror, completed missions despite knowing the odds, and to the German defenders who faced those formations, who fought with skill and courage despite facing impossible odds, who learned the hardest lesson of industrial warfare, that sometimes no amount of individual excellence can overcome massed firepower applied systematically. When 54 B-17s flew overhead in tight formation, 700 machine guns pointing in every direction, the message was clear and undeniable. The skies belonged to America, and everything beneath those skies was in the kill zone. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.